What if everything you've been taught about the greatest betrayal in human history is completely wrong? What if the man whose name has become synonymous with treachery was actually the most faithful disciple of all? What if Judas Iscariot, the figure we've been told sold out the Son of God for 30 pieces of silver, was in fact carrying out the most sacred mission ever entrusted to a human being? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most explosive and forbidden texts ever discovered, a document so dangerous that it was buried in the Egyptian desert for nearly 2,000 years, a gospel so controversial that it threatens to shatter everything the Christian world believes about salvation, betrayal, and the very nature of God himself. This isn't just another ancient manuscript. This is the Gospel of Judas, and what it reveals will leave you questioning not just history, but the foundations of faith itself. Before we begin this journey into forbidden territory, I need you to understand something crucial. What we're about to explore has been condemned by church authorities, dismissed by theologians, and hidden from believers for centuries. But buried within these ancient pages lies a story so profound, so earth-shattering, that it demands to be told. You see, most people assume they know the story of Judas, the greedy disciple who betrayed Jesus for money. The ultimate villain in Christianity's greatest drama, the man whose kiss in the Garden of Gethsemane sealed the fate of the Messiah. Simple, clear, complete. But what if that's not the whole truth? What if there's another side to this story? One that's been deliberately suppressed, systematically destroyed, and carefully erased from Christian memory. This journey we're about to take together will challenge everything you thought you knew about the New Testament. It will force you to reconsider assumptions about good and evil, betrayal and loyalty that have shaped Western civilization for 2 millennia. By the end of this exploration, you won't just know the traditional story. You'll understand the hidden narrative that early church fathers fought desperately to bury forever. So settle in, open your mind, and prepare to discover the forbidden gospel that reveals Judas Iscariot not as Christianity's greatest villain, but as its most misunderstood hero. Let's start with a moment that changed everything. Picture this. It's 1978, and deep in the desert sands of Middle Egypt, near the ancient town of Minya, antiquities dealers uncover something extraordinary. Hidden within a limestone box wrapped in papyrus and leather lies a collection of manuscripts that have been waiting in darkness for over 17 centuries. Among these texts is a document written in Coptic, the ancient Egyptian language, containing words that would send shockwaves through the Christian world. The pages are fragile, damaged by time and the elements, but what remains is enough to reconstruct one of the most controversial gospels ever written. The Gospel of Judas. For decades, this manuscript remained in the shadows of the antiquities market, changing hands between dealers who had no idea they possessed something that could rewrite Christian history. It wasn't until the early 2000s that scholars finally gained access to this forbidden text, and what they discovered was nothing short of revolutionary. But here's what makes this discovery even more remarkable. This wasn't just any random ancient text. Church historians had known about the Gospel of Judas for centuries. Around 180 AD, an early church father named Irenaeus wrote about this very gospel in his work Against Heresies, condemning it as dangerous fiction that threatened the foundations of Christian faith. Irenaeus described it as a fabrication used by a heretical sect called the Gnostics, people who claim to possess secret knowledge about the true nature of reality. For nearly 2,000 years, scholars assumed this gospel was lost forever, destroyed by Orthodox Christians who saw it as a threat to their authority. Yet here it was, emerging from the Egyptian desert like a message from the ancient world, carrying with it secrets that early church leaders had tried to erase from history forever. The text itself is incomplete. Time and the elements have taken their toll, leaving gaps in the narrative that scholars must piece together like an ancient puzzle. But what survives is enough to reveal a story so radically different from the traditional Gospels that it reads like an alternate universe version of Christianity's founding drama. In this forbidden Gospel, we encounter a Jesus unlike any portrayed in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. This Jesus doesn't just preach to crowds or perform miracles. He shares profound secrets with his disciples about the nature of reality itself, the origins of the universe, and humanity's true spiritual destiny. But most shocking of all, this Jesus has a special relationship with one particular disciple, not Peter, who would become the rock upon which the church was built, not John, the beloved disciple who would pen his own gospel, but Judas Iscariot, the man history would remember as the ultimate traitor. According to this forbidden text, Judas alone among the 12 disciples truly understands who Jesus is and what he came to accomplish. While the other disciples worship Jesus as a god, Judas sees through the illusion to recognize Jesus' true divine nature. While the others cling to traditional Jewish expectations of a political Messiah, Judas grasps the cosmic significance of Jesus' mission. The Gospel presents conversations between Jesus and Judas that never appear in the canonical scriptures. Private moments where Jesus reveals mysteries about the structure of the universe, the nature of the human soul, and the path to spiritual liberation that awaits those who possess true knowledge. These aren't just theological discussions. They're initiations into secret wisdom that the traditional Gospels suggest was reserved for a select few. Knowledge so profound that it could only be shared with someone capable of understanding its full implications. And who was that someone? According to this forbidden gospel, it was Judas Iscariot. But the most explosive revelation comes in how this text portrays the betrayal itself. In the traditional Gospels, Judas betrays Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, motivated by greed or perhaps influenced by Satan. The kiss in Gethsemane becomes the ultimate symbol of false friendship and devastating treachery. The Gospel of Judas tells a completely different story. Here, there is no betrayal in the conventional sense. Instead, Jesus himself asks Judas to hand him over to the authorities, not because Judas has fallen to temptation or corruption, but because this act is essential to fulfilling a divine plan that transcends human understanding. In one of the most haunting passages of this forbidden text, Jesus tells Judas, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." This isn't the language of betrayal. This is the language of sacred mission, of a task so important that it could only be entrusted to the most faithful and understanding of all the disciples. The Gospel suggests that Judas's act wasn't a failure of loyalty, but the ultimate expression of it. By agreeing to play the role of betrayer, Judas was accepting a burden that would make him history's most hated man, all in service of a cosmic purpose that only he and Jesus truly understood. This radically transforms the entire Passion narrative. The arrest in Gethsemane becomes not the result of treachery, but the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan designed to liberate Jesus' divine spirit from its earthly prison. Judas's kiss becomes not a sign of betrayal, but a signal of profound love and ultimate sacrifice. But why would such a story be so dangerous that early church leaders felt compelled to suppress it completely? To understand the threat posed by the Gospel of Judas, we need to grasp how fundamentally it challenges the foundations of Orthodox Christianity. The traditional Christian narrative depends on clear distinctions between good and evil, faithful and unfaithful, saved and damned. Judas serves as the perfect villain in this drama, the cautionary tale of what happens when greed and betrayal overcome loyalty and faith. But if Judas was actually the hero of the story, if his apparent betrayal was really the most faithful act possible, then the entire moral framework of Christianity begins to collapse. If the greatest villain was actually the greatest saint, then how can we trust any of the other judgments about right and wrong that have shaped Christian civilization? The implications go even deeper. The Gospel of Judas doesn't just rehabilitate one misunderstood disciple. It presents an entirely different understanding of Jesus' mission, the nature of salvation, and the structure of spiritual reality itself. In the traditional Gospels, Jesus comes to save humanity through his death and resurrection, establishing a church that would carry his message to all nations. The 12 disciples, despite their flaws, become the apostolic foundation upon which this church is built. But the Gospel of Judas suggests something far more radical. Here, Jesus' mission isn't to establish an earthly institution, but to reveal secret knowledge that can liberate the human spirit from the material world entirely. The other disciples, far from being apostolic heroes, are portrayed as fundamentally misunderstanding Jesus' true purpose. In one particularly shocking passage, Jesus laughs at the other disciples when they describe a vision of the temple and its sacrifices. He tells them they have been deceived, that the God they worship through traditional religious practices is not the true divine source, but a lesser deity who has trapped humanity in ignorance and suffering. This isn't just a different interpretation of Christianity. This is a completely different religion, one that would later be known as Gnosticism, from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge. Gnostics believed that the material world was a prison created by an ignorant or malevolent deity, and that salvation came not through faith or good works, but through acquiring secret knowledge about one's true, divine nature. For Orthodox Christians developing their theology in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Gnosticism represented an existential threat. If the Gnostics were right, then the entire structure of the emerging church, with its bishops, priests, and sacraments, was not just unnecessary, but actually counterproductive to spiritual liberation. The Gospel of Judas embodies this threat perfectly. It suggests that the disciple who truly understood Jesus was the one who was cast out and condemned, while those who became the foundation of the church were operating from fundamental misunderstanding. This is why early church fathers like Irenaeus fought so hard against texts like the Gospel of Judas. They weren't just defending theological positions. They were defending the legitimacy of the entire Christian institutional structure that was beginning to emerge. But the Forbidden Gospel's challenge to Orthodox Christianity goes even deeper than questions of church authority. It presents a radically different understanding of the divine itself, one that would have been deeply disturbing to believers who had been taught about a loving God who created the world and pronounced it good. In the cosmology presented in the Gospel of Judas, the universe is far more complex and troubling than traditional Christian theology suggests. The material world isn't the good creation of a benevolent deity, but a flawed copy of spiritual reality created by lesser divine beings who either don't understand or actively oppose the true divine source. This cosmic drama plays out on multiple levels, with various divine beings, spiritual realms, and hidden powers all playing roles in the grand theater of existence. Humanity finds itself trapped in this complex system, most people completely unaware of their true spiritual nature or the forces that control their earthly experience. Into this cosmic struggle comes Jesus, not as the Son of the Creator God worshipped in traditional Judaism and Christianity, but as an emissary from the highest divine realm, sent to awaken a select few to the truth about their situation and the path to liberation, and the one person most capable of understanding and acting upon this cosmic revelation. According to the Forbidden Gospel, it was Judas Iscariot, the disciple history would remember as the ultimate traitor, but who was actually the ultimate initiate into mysteries that would remain hidden from the world for nearly 2,000 years. This understanding of Judas as the enlightened disciple creates a profound paradox that strikes at the heart of how we understand truth, loyalty, and spiritual authority. If the man condemned by history as the greatest betrayer was actually the most faithful follower, what does that say about our ability to distinguish between good and evil, between authentic spirituality and dangerous deception? The Gospel of Judas forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of religious authority and the process by which certain texts become scripture while others are condemned as heresy. Who decides which version of events is true? What criteria determine which Gospels are included in the biblical canon and which are relegated to the category of dangerous fiction? These aren't just historical questions. They're profound challenges to how we understand truth itself, particularly religious truth that claims to reveal the ultimate nature of reality and humanity's place within it. As we continue our exploration of this forbidden gospel, we'll discover how its revolutionary portrait of Judas Iscariot connects to broader questions about the nature of spiritual knowledge, the relationship between faith and doubt, and the possibility that the greatest truths might sometimes be found in the most unexpected places. The story of the Gospel of Judas is far from over. In fact, what we've uncovered so far is just the beginning of a mystery that will take us deep into the hidden history of early Christianity, the secret teachings of the Gnostic movements, and the fierce battles fought over who would control the narrative of humanity's relationship with the divine. But before we venture further into this forbidden territory, we need to understand exactly how this dangerous text remained hidden for so long, and why its rediscovery in the modern era has created such controversy among scholars, theologians, and believers around the world. The battle for control over Christian truth began almost immediately after Jesus' death, and the Gospel of Judas provides a window into just how fierce that struggle became. What most people don't realize is that the Christianity we know today emerged victorious from a theological war that raged for centuries, leaving behind a battlefield littered with suppressed texts, condemned teachers, and alternative versions of the faith that were systematically erased from history. The Gnostic communities that preserved texts like the Gospel of Judas weren't just offering different interpretations of familiar stories. They were presenting an entirely different religious framework, one that challenged not only specific Christian doctrines, but the very foundations upon which institutional Christianity was being built. To understand why the Gospel of Judas was so dangerous, we need to step into the world of second-century Christianity, a time when the faith was still fluid, when dozens of different Christian communities were developing their own interpretations of Jesus' teachings, and when the question of which books would become scripture was still very much up for debate. Imagine walking through the markets of Alexandria or Antioch in the year 150 AD. You might encounter followers of Marcion, who believed the God of the Old Testament was different from the God revealed by Jesus. You could meet Valentinians, who taught that salvation came through understanding complex spiritual hierarchies. You might sit in on gatherings of Scythians, who claimed that the serpent in the Garden of Eden was actually a liberator bringing knowledge to humanity. Each of these groups possessed their own sacred texts, their own interpretations of Jesus' identity and mission, their own understanding of what it meant to be a Christian. The Gospel of Judas emerged from this diverse landscape as one of the most sophisticated and challenging alternatives to what would eventually become Orthodox Christianity. But what made Gnostic Christianity so appealing to its followers and so threatening to Orthodox leaders? The answer lies in the fundamental promise at the heart of Gnostic teaching, that ordinary human beings could access divine knowledge directly without the need for institutional mediation. While emerging Orthodox Christianity emphasized faith, obedience to church authority, and participation in sacraments administered by ordained clergy, Gnosticism offered something far more radical: the possibility of personal enlightenment and direct spiritual transformation. The Gospel of Judas embodies this promise perfectly. Here we see Jesus sharing the deepest cosmic secrets not with Peter, who would become the first pope, or with the apostolic college that would form the foundation of the institutional church, but with a single disciple who was capable of understanding and acting upon revolutionary spiritual knowledge. This wasn't just a different story about Judas. It was a different model of spiritual authority altogether, one that suggested the most important religious truths might be found not in public teachings or official doctrines, but in private revelations shared between master and disciple in moments of profound intimacy and understanding. Consider how this challenged the developing structure of Orthodox Christianity. By the mid-2nd century, Christian communities were beginning to organize around bishops who claimed apostolic succession, tracing their authority back to the 12 disciples chosen by Jesus. These bishops were establishing standardized practices, determining which texts could be read in worship services, and defining the boundaries between acceptable and heretical belief. The Gospel of Judas struck at the heart of this entire system. If Judas, the condemned traitor, was actually Jesus' most trusted confidant and the recipient of his deepest teachings, then what did that say about the apostolic authority claimed by the bishops? If the other 11 disciples fundamentally misunderstood Jesus' mission, as the Forbidden Gospel suggests, then how could they serve as the foundation for authentic Christian teaching? The text presents this challenge with devastating clarity. In one particularly pointed passage, Jesus tells Judas that he will be cursed by the other disciples and their followers, but that this persecution will actually be a sign of his special status. The Gospel suggests that being rejected by the emerging institutional church isn't evidence of error, but proof of authentic spiritual insight. This inversion of traditional values runs throughout the Forbidden Gospel, where Orthodox Christianity taught that suffering was redemptive when accepted with faith and humility. The Gospel of Judas suggests that the greatest spiritual hero is the one willing to accept the burden of being history's most hated man. Where traditional teachings emphasize the importance of community and collective worship, this text celebrates the solitary figure who possesses knowledge too profound for others to understand. The cosmological framework presented in the Gospel of Judas takes these inversions to their logical extreme. The God worshipped by traditional Jews and Christians isn't the ultimate divine reality, but a lesser deity who has created a flawed material world that traps spiritual beings in ignorance and suffering. The religious practices endorsed by this false god, including temple sacrifices and community rituals, aren't pathways to salvation but instruments of continued bondage. This cosmology explained something that troubled many thoughtful people in the ancient world. If God is truly good and all-powerful, why is the world filled with suffering, injustice, and evil? Traditional Christianity struggled with this question, eventually developing complex theological explanations involving human free will, the fall of Adam and Eve, and the mysterious purposes of divine providence. Gnosticism offered a simpler and more radical solution. The world is filled with suffering because it wasn't created by the true God at all, but by an ignorant or malevolent lesser deity who either doesn't understand or actively opposes genuine spiritual welfare. Salvation doesn't come through accepting this situation with faith, but through acquiring the knowledge necessary to escape it entirely. The Gospel of Judas presents Jesus as the bearer of this liberating knowledge, sent from the highest divine realm to awaken select individuals to their true spiritual nature. But this awakening comes with a terrible price. Those who truly understand the nature of reality must live as strangers in a world created by forces opposed to their spiritual welfare. Judas becomes the perfect symbol of this tragic enlightenment. By accepting his role in Jesus' crucifixion, he enables the liberation of Jesus' divine spirit from its material prison, while simultaneously accepting the burden of eternal condemnation in the eyes of a world that cannot understand the cosmic significance of his action. This portrait of Judas as the ultimate spiritual hero created profound problems for Orthodox Christian teachers. The traditional narrative depends on clear moral categories. Jesus is good, Judas is evil. The faithful disciples are models to emulate. The betrayer is a cautionary tale about the dangers of greed and faithlessness. These simple distinctions made Christianity accessible to ordinary believers and provided clear guidelines for Christian living. But the Gospel of Judas shatters these comfortable categories. If the apparent villain is actually the hero, if betrayal is actually the highest form of loyalty, if the condemned disciple is actually the most enlightened, then how can ordinary believers navigate the complex moral landscape of spiritual life? How can church leaders maintain authority when the text suggests that official condemnation might actually be a sign of spiritual authenticity? Early church fathers like Irenaeus recognized immediately that texts like the Gospel of Judas posed an existential threat to the Christianity they were trying to establish. It wasn't enough to argue that these texts were wrong. They had to be exposed as actively dangerous, capable of leading sincere believers away from salvation and into spiritual destruction. Irenaeus developed sophisticated arguments against Gnostic teaching, but his most effective weapon was simpler. He branded these alternative gospels as fictions created by heretics who were either deluded or deliberately deceptive. By questioning the authenticity and authority of texts like the Gospel of Judas, Orthodox leaders could dismiss their challenging content without engaging with the profound questions they raised about the nature of spiritual truth and religious authority. This strategy proved remarkably effective. Over the course of several centuries, Orthodox Christianity succeeded in marginalizing Gnostic communities, confiscating and destroying their texts, and establishing a unified church structure that could speak with one voice about essential Christian truths. The Gospel of Judas and dozens of similar texts disappeared from public view, surviving only in hidden libraries like the one discovered in Egypt in 1978. But the victory of Orthodox Christianity came at a significant cost. In suppressing alternative gospels like the Gospel of Judas, the early church also eliminated voices that might have enriched Christian understanding of complex spiritual and theological questions. The diverse, creative, intellectually adventurous Christianity of the 2nd century gave way to a more uniform but potentially less dynamic faith. The rediscovery of the Gospel of Judas in the modern era forces us to confront what was lost in that ancient victory. Here we encounter a version of Christianity that takes seriously the most profound questions about the nature of reality, the problem of evil, and the relationship between spiritual knowledge and institutional authority. Whether we accept its answers or not, the Forbidden Gospel challenges us to grapple with mysteries that simplified Orthodox teachings sometimes gloss over. The text also raises troubling questions about how religious truth is determined and preserved. The Gospel of Judas wasn't rejected because it was obviously false or spiritually barren, but because it threatened the institutional structure that Orthodox leaders were trying to establish. Its suppression was as much a political act as a theological one, designed to eliminate competition for religious authority rather than to protect believers from dangerous error. This historical reality has profound implications for how we understand the development of Christian doctrine and the formation of the biblical canon. The books that became the New Testament weren't chosen simply because they were more authentic or spiritually valuable than the alternatives, but because they supported the institutional and theological agenda of the communities that gained political power in the Roman Empire. The Gospel of Judas offers a glimpse into a road not taken, a version of Christianity that might have developed if different voices had gained ascendancy in those crucial early centuries. It's impossible to know how different Christian civilization might have been if texts like this had been preserved and studied rather than condemned and destroyed. But perhaps the most significant contribution of the Forbidden Gospel lies not in its specific teachings about Judas or its complex cosmological speculations, but in its fundamental challenge to spiritual complacency. By presenting the ultimate traitor as the ultimate hero, it forces us to question our assumptions about good and evil, faithfulness and betrayal, truth and falsehood. In our own time, when religious institutions face unprecedented challenges to their authority and relevance, the Gospel of Judas provides a valuable perspective on the relationship between institutional power and authentic spirituality. It reminds us that the most important spiritual truths might sometimes be found in unexpected places, preserved by marginalized communities, or embodied in figures that official authorities have condemned. The Forbidden Gospel also speaks to contemporary concerns about the nature of knowledge and the sources of authority in a democratic age. If Judas could be so completely misunderstood by history, what other judgments might we need to reconsider? If the early church could suppress texts that challenged its authority, what other voices might have been silenced in the pursuit of institutional control? These questions extend far beyond Christianity to encompass broader issues about how societies determine truth, preserve knowledge, and maintain the balance between institutional authority and individual insight. The Gospel of Judas serves as a case study in how alternative perspectives can be marginalized and eventually eliminated, leaving behind a historical record that reflects the interests of those who gained power rather than the full complexity of human experience. As we continue to explore this forbidden text, we'll discover how its portrait of Judas as the enlightened disciple connects to broader patterns in human history, where the most profound truths are sometimes preserved by the most unlikely guardians, and where apparent defeat might actually represent a different kind of victory altogether. The story of Judas Iscariot, as told in this Forbidden Gospel, isn't just about one misunderstood disciple or one suppressed text. It's about the eternal human struggle to distinguish between authentic spirituality and institutional religion, between transformative truth and comfortable convention, between the courage to embrace difficult knowledge and the temptation to accept simplified answers to life's most complex questions. The Forbidden Gospel's most shocking revelation isn't just that Judas was misunderstood. It's that he was specifically chosen for his role, precisely because he possessed a level of spiritual comprehension that the other disciples simply couldn't achieve. This wasn't about moral superiority or personal worthiness. This was about cosmic understanding. In the traditional Gospels, we see Jesus teaching in parables, speaking in metaphors that his disciples often struggle to grasp. They ask for explanations, miss the deeper meanings, and frequently demonstrate their limited understanding of Jesus' true mission. Peter denies knowing Jesus 3 times. Thomas doubts the resurrection. James and John argue about who will sit at Jesus' right hand in glory. But in the Gospel of Judas, we encounter a completely different dynamic. Here, Judas alone comprehends the multi-layered nature of reality that Jesus is revealing. While the other disciples see only the surface level of Jesus' teachings, Judas perceives the deeper cosmic drama unfolding beneath everyday events. The text presents private conversations between Jesus and Judas that reveal the true structure of existence itself. Jesus describes a universe far more complex than anything suggested in the canonical scriptures. Multiple realms of reality, hierarchies of divine beings, and spiritual dimensions that most humans can't even imagine, let alone understand. According to this forbidden gospel, the physical world we inhabit is just the lowest level of a vast spiritual hierarchy. Above our material realm exist countless spiritual spheres, each populated by divine beings of increasing power and wisdom. At the highest level dwells the true, unknowable God, so transcendent that it cannot be directly approached or comprehended by ordinary consciousness. But here's where the story becomes truly revolutionary. The God worshipped in traditional Judaism and early Christianity isn't this ultimate divine reality at all. Instead, it's a lesser divine being who has mistaken itself for the supreme deity. This false god, sometimes called the demiurge in Gnostic texts, has created the material world as a kind of prison designed to trap spiritual beings in ignorance of their true nature. This cosmic deception operates on every level of existence. The religious institutions, sacred texts, and spiritual practices endorsed by the false god aren't pathways to enlightenment, but instruments of continued bondage. Even the disciples' worship of Jesus as the Messiah represents a fundamental misunderstanding of his true identity and purpose. Jesus, according to this forbidden narrative, isn't the Son of the Creator God at all. He's an emissary from the highest divine realm, sent to awaken select individuals to the truth about their spiritual imprisonment and the path to liberation. But this awakening can only occur through the acquisition of secret knowledge, gnosis, that reveals the true nature of reality and humanity's place within it. And who among the disciples was capable of receiving and acting upon this dangerous knowledge? Only Judas Iscariot possessed the spiritual sophistication necessary to understand the cosmic significance of what Jesus was revealing and the courage to play his assigned role in the divine drama of liberation. The Forbidden Gospel presents Judas's decision to hand Jesus over to the authorities not as a moment of weakness or betrayal, but as the culmination of his spiritual development. Unlike the other disciples who clung to earthly expectations and material concerns, Judas had transcended ordinary human attachments and achieved a state of consciousness capable of serving the highest spiritual purposes. This portrait of Judas as the enlightened disciple creates a profound inversion of traditional Christian values. Where Orthodox teaching celebrates faith, hope, and love as the supreme virtues, the Gospel of Judas suggests that the highest spiritual achievement is the acquisition of knowledge so profound that it enables one to act against conventional morality in service of cosmic truth. The text describes Judas experiencing mystical visions that reveal the true structure of the universe and his own divine origins. Unlike the other disciples who remain trapped in ordinary consciousness, Judas achieves a state of spiritual awakening that allows him to see through the illusions that bind most human beings to ignorance and suffering. But this enlightenment comes with a terrible burden. Judas understands that his role in the cosmic drama will make him the most hated man in human history. He knows that his apparent betrayal will be misunderstood by everyone except Jesus himself. He accepts that he will be condemned, cursed, and reviled by countless generations who cannot comprehend the true significance of his actions. Yet according to the Forbidden Gospel, Judas embraces this destiny willingly because he understands that someone must be willing to sacrifice not just their life, but their reputation, their legacy, and their place in human memory in order to facilitate Jesus' liberation from the material realm. This understanding of sacrifice goes far beyond anything suggested in the canonical Gospels. Where traditional Christianity celebrates martyrs who died for their faith, the Gospel of Judas presents a figure who was willing to live forever as history's greatest villain in order to serve the highest spiritual purposes. This is martyrdom of a completely different order, requiring not just physical courage, but the spiritual strength to endure eternal condemnation for the sake of cosmic truth. The implications of this narrative extend far beyond questions about one historical figure. If Judas was actually serving the highest spiritual purposes while appearing to commit the ultimate betrayal, then how can we trust our ordinary moral categories to guide us in distinguishing between good and evil? How can we be certain that apparent virtue isn't actually spiritual blindness, or that apparent wickedness isn't actually enlightened service? The Gospel of Judas forces us to confront the possibility that our most fundamental assumptions about right and wrong might be completely inverted. The disciples we've been taught to admire might actually represent spiritual limitation, while the figure we've been taught to despise might embody the highest form of spiritual achievement. This inversion has profound implications for how we understand religious authority and institutional legitimacy. If the 12 disciples who became the foundation of the Christian Church were fundamentally mistaken about Jesus' identity and mission, then what does that say about the authority of the institutions they established? How can we trust teachings that emerged from such fundamental misunderstanding? The Forbidden Gospel suggests that authentic spiritual wisdom might be found not in official religious institutions, but in hidden traditions preserved by marginalized communities who possessed secret knowledge about the true nature of reality. This creates a direct challenge to any form of religious authority that claims exclusive access to divine truth. But the text goes even further in its challenge to conventional spirituality. It suggests that the very concept of a loving Creator God who made the world and pronounced it good is itself a deception perpetrated by the false deity who rules the material realm. The suffering, injustice, and evil we observe in the world aren't unfortunate consequences of human free will or mysterious elements of a divine plan we can't understand. They're direct results of our imprisonment in a realm created by a deity who either doesn't comprehend or actively opposes genuine spiritual welfare. This cosmological framework provides answers to questions that have troubled thoughtful believers for millennia. Why do the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper? Why does evil seem so prevalent and powerful in the world? Why do human beings feel such a profound sense of alienation from their earthly existence? According to the Gospel of Judas, these aren't theological mysteries requiring faith to accept. They're natural consequences of our spiritual imprisonment in a realm designed to prevent us from discovering our true divine nature. The path to liberation from this imprisonment doesn't involve faith, good works, or participation in religious sacraments. It requires the acquisition of secret knowledge about the true structure of reality and the courage to act upon that knowledge even when doing so violates conventional moral expectations. Judas becomes the perfect embodiment of this path to liberation. By acquiring the secret knowledge Jesus revealed to him alone, and by acting upon that knowledge despite knowing the terrible personal consequences, Judas demonstrates what it means to serve authentic spiritual purposes rather than conventional religious expectations. The Forbidden Gospel presents this service as the highest form of love possible. While ordinary love might involve personal affection, emotional attachment, or mutual benefit, the love demonstrated by Judas transcends all personal considerations in service of cosmic truth. He loves Jesus enough to accept eternal condemnation in order to facilitate his liberation. He loves humanity enough to play the role of history's greatest villain if doing so serves the ultimate purpose of spiritual awakening. This understanding of love as potentially requiring actions that appear cruel or destructive challenges every conventional notion of virtue and morality. It suggests that the most profound spiritual service might sometimes require us to act against our natural inclinations, our social conditioning, and even our moral intuitions in order to serve purposes that transcend ordinary human understanding. The Gospel of Judas implies that this kind of transcendent service is available to anyone willing to acquire the necessary knowledge and develop the spiritual courage to act upon it. Judas isn't presented as a unique individual with special qualities that set him apart from other human beings. He's portrayed as someone who achieved a level of understanding and commitment that is theoretically accessible to anyone willing to pursue it. But the text also makes clear that this path is extraordinarily demanding and dangerous. Those who acquire genuine spiritual knowledge must be prepared to live as strangers in a world that operates according to principles they know to be false. They must be willing to be misunderstood, condemned, and persecuted by people who cannot comprehend the true significance of their actions. The Forbidden Gospel suggests that this persecution isn't an unfortunate side effect of spiritual advancement, but an inevitable consequence of it. Those who serve authentic spiritual purposes will necessarily come into conflict with the institutions and authorities that derive their power from maintaining the illusions that keep humanity trapped in ignorance. This creates a profound paradox at the heart of the Gnostic worldview presented in the Gospel of Judas. The more spiritually advanced someone becomes, the more they will appear to be enemies of conventional religion and morality. The closer they come to serving the highest spiritual purposes, the more they will be condemned by the very people they're actually trying to help. Judas embodies this paradox perfectly. By serving Jesus' highest spiritual needs, he becomes Christianity's ultimate villain. By demonstrating the most profound form of love and loyalty, he becomes history's symbol of betrayal and faithlessness. By achieving the greatest spiritual understanding, he becomes the disciple most condemned by those who claim to follow Jesus' teachings. The Forbidden Gospel presents this ironic outcome not as a tragic accident, but as an inevitable feature of how spiritual truth operates in a world controlled by forces opposed to genuine enlightenment. Those who possess authentic wisdom will necessarily be rejected by institutions that depend on maintaining ignorance for their authority. This understanding of the relationship between spiritual truth and worldly power has profound implications for how we evaluate religious institutions, political authorities, and social conventions in our own time. The Gospel of Judas suggests that we should be deeply suspicious of any authority that claims exclusive access to truth while condemning alternative perspectives as dangerous or heretical. The text implies that the most important spiritual insights might be found not in officially sanctioned teachings, but in suppressed traditions, marginalized communities, and figures who have been condemned by established authorities. If Judas could be so completely misunderstood by history, what other valuable perspectives might we have lost to institutional prejudice and political convenience? These questions become particularly relevant when we consider how the Gospel of Judas itself was preserved and transmitted. This text survived not through official church channels, but through underground communities who risked persecution to maintain alternative spiritual traditions. The manuscript that emerged from the Egyptian desert in 1978 represents not just an ancient document, but a testament to the courage of people who preserved dangerous knowledge despite enormous personal risk. The rediscovery of this forbidden gospel in our own time creates an opportunity to reconsider assumptions about spiritual authority, religious truth, and the relationship between institutional power and authentic wisdom that have shaped Western civilization for nearly 2 millennia. Whether we accept its specific teachings or not, the Gospel of Judas challenges us to think more critically about how religious truth is determined and preserved. As we prepare to delve deeper into the specific revelations contained within this forbidden text, we must grapple with the possibility that some of our most fundamental beliefs about good and evil, faithfulness and betrayal, truth and falsehood, might be far more complex and paradoxical than we ever imagined. The story of Judas Iscariot, as told in this dangerous gospel, isn't just about one misunderstood disciple. It's about the eternal human challenge of distinguishing between authentic spirituality and convenient deception, between transformative truth and comfortable lies. The Forbidden Gospel's portrait of Judas as the enlightened betrayer forces us to confront questions that go to the very heart of what it means to live a spiritually authentic life, in a world where the highest truths might sometimes be found in the most unexpected and unwelcome places. But to truly grasp the revolutionary nature of what this Forbidden Gospel reveals, we need to examine the specific conversations it records between Jesus and Judas. These aren't casual exchanges or public teachings. These are intimate revelations shared in moments of profound spiritual communion, dialogues that expose the deepest mysteries of existence itself. The Gospel of Judas preserves fragments of these conversations, and what survives is enough to show us why early church leaders were so terrified of this text. In one particularly striking passage, Jesus takes Judas aside from the other disciples and begins to unveil the true nature of the cosmos in ways that would fundamentally challenge everything the emerging Christian church was teaching about God, creation, and salvation. Jesus begins by explaining to Judas that the universe operates on multiple levels of reality, each governed by different spiritual forces with vastly different agendas. The material world that humans inhabit isn't the pinnacle of God's creation, as traditional Jewish and Christian theology maintained. Instead, it's a kind of spiritual prison designed to keep divine souls trapped in ignorance of their true nature. According to this forbidden dialogue, the God worshipped by the Jews and early Christians isn't the ultimate divine reality at all. This deity, whom Gnostic texts often call the demiurge, is actually a lesser spiritual being who has either mistakenly or deliberately created a flawed copy of the true spiritual realm. This false creator God genuinely believes itself to be supreme, and it demands worship and obedience from the human beings it has trapped in material bodies. The implications of this revelation are staggering. Every prayer offered to the Creator God, every sacrifice made in the temple, every act of worship performed by devout believers isn't actually reaching the true divine source. Instead, these religious acts are feeding the power of a deluded or malevolent entity that benefits from keeping humanity in spiritual darkness. But Jesus, according to this forbidden gospel, isn't the son of this false creator God. He's an emissary from the highest divine realm, sent to awaken select individuals to the truth about their spiritual imprisonment. His mission isn't to establish a religion or found a church, but to share secret knowledge that can liberate human souls from their material prison and restore them to their original divine state. And who among the 12 disciples was capable of receiving and comprehending this dangerous knowledge? The text makes it clear that only Judas possessed the spiritual sophistication necessary to grasp these cosmic revelations and the courage to act upon them. The Gospel of Judas describes a moment when Jesus reveals to Judas a vision of the spiritual hierarchy that governs all existence. This vision encompasses multiple levels of divine reality, populated by various classes of spiritual beings, each with their own roles in the cosmic drama of entrapment and liberation. At the lowest level is the material world where human beings live out their earthly existence, completely unaware that their physical bodies are prisons for divine souls that originated in much higher spiritual realms. Above this material level exist various intermediate spiritual spheres, populated by angels, demons, and other spiritual entities who either serve the false creator God or work to liberate souls from his dominion. At the highest level, beyond the reach of ordinary consciousness, dwells the true, unknowable God, so transcendent that it can't be directly approached or comprehended through normal religious practices. This ultimate divine reality doesn't create material worlds or demand worship. Instead, it emanates pure spiritual light that filters down through the various levels of existence, occasionally breaking through to awaken individual souls to their true divine nature. The vision revealed to Judas explains why the world is filled with suffering, injustice, and evil despite being supposedly created by an all-good, all-powerful deity. According to this cosmic framework, These negative experiences aren't mysterious elements of a divine plan we can't understand. They're natural consequences of our imprisonment in a realm created by a spiritual being who either doesn't comprehend or actively opposes genuine human welfare. This understanding completely transforms the meaning of Jesus' mission. He didn't come to establish a new religion or reform an existing one. He came to share secret knowledge about the true structure of reality and the path to liberation from spiritual imprisonment. But this knowledge is so dangerous to the powers that control the material world that it can only be shared with individuals who have developed the spiritual capacity to receive it without being destroyed by its implications. The Gospel of Judas suggests that most of the 12 disciples never achieved this level of spiritual development. They remained trapped in conventional religious thinking, worshiping Jesus as a traditional Messiah and expecting him to establish an earthly kingdom. Even after witnessing his miracles and hearing his teachings, they continued to operate from the limited perspective of ordinary human consciousness. But Judas was different. The text describes him experiencing mystical visions that revealed his own divine origins and cosmic destiny. Unlike the other disciples, who saw only the surface level of Jesus' identity and mission, Judas perceived the deeper spiritual drama unfolding beneath everyday events. In one of the most profound passages in the Forbidden Gospel, Jesus tells Judas about the true nature of the human soul and its relationship to the divine realm. According to this teaching, every human being contains a spark of the highest divine light, but this spark has become trapped in material existence and forgotten its true origin. Most people live their entire lives without ever awakening to their divine nature, dying in ignorance and being recycled back into material existence. But some individuals, through the acquisition of secret knowledge and the development of spiritual understanding, can remember their true identity and find the path back to the divine realm from which they originally came. These awakened souls become threats to the system of spiritual imprisonment that the false creator God has established, which is why they're often persecuted by religious and political authorities who derive their power from maintaining the status quo. Jesus reveals to Judas that his own mission involves not just sharing this liberating knowledge, but demonstrating through his death and spiritual liberation that it's possible for divine souls to escape the material prison and return to their true home. But for this demonstration to be effective, someone must be willing to play the role of facilitator, enabling Jesus' arrest and crucifixion while understanding the true spiritual significance of these events. The Gospel of Judas presents this role not as a burden imposed upon an unwilling victim, but as the highest honor that could be bestowed upon a disciple. Only someone who had achieved profound spiritual understanding could be trusted with such a crucial mission. Only someone who had transcended ordinary human attachments and moral categories could act against conventional expectations in service of cosmic truth. The text describes Jesus asking Judas to perform this service not as a master commanding a servant, but as one enlightened being requesting assistance from another. The language used suggests deep mutual respect and understanding between two individuals who have achieved similar levels of spiritual development and are working together to serve the highest possible purposes. This portrayal completely transforms the meaning of the betrayal scene in Gethsemane. Rather than a moment of treachery motivated by greed or corruption, it becomes the culmination of a sacred partnership between two individuals who understand the cosmic significance of what they're accomplishing together. Judas's kiss becomes not a sign of false friendship, but a signal of profound love and ultimate sacrifice. The Forbidden Gospel suggests that this sacrifice involved not just Judas's willingness to hand Jesus over to the authorities, but his acceptance of eternal condemnation in the eyes of history. He understood that his role in the cosmic drama would make him the most hated man who ever lived, that his name would become synonymous with betrayal and faithlessness for countless generations. Yet, according to this text, Judas embraced this destiny willingly because he recognized that someone had to be willing to sacrifice not just their life, but their reputation and their place in human memory in order to facilitate the liberation of divine souls from material imprisonment. This represents a form of martyrdom far more demanding than physical death, requiring the spiritual strength to endure eternal misunderstanding for the sake of cosmic truth. The Gospel of Judas implies that this kind of transcendent sacrifice is the ultimate expression of spiritual love. While ordinary love involves personal affection, emotional attachment, or mutual benefit, the love demonstrated by Judas transcends all personal considerations in service of the highest spiritual purposes. He loves Jesus enough to accept eternal condemnation in order to facilitate his liberation. He loves humanity enough to play the role of history's greatest villain, if doing so serves the ultimate goal of spiritual awakening. This understanding of love as potentially requiring actions that appear cruel or destructive challenges every conventional notion of virtue and morality. It suggests that the most profound spiritual service might sometimes demand that we act against our natural inclinations, our social conditioning, and even our moral intuitions in order to serve purposes that transcend ordinary human understanding. The implications of this teaching extend far beyond questions about one historical figure. If the ultimate spiritual hero could appear to be the ultimate villain, then how can we trust our ordinary moral categories to guide us in distinguishing between authentic spirituality and dangerous deception? How can we be certain that apparent virtue isn't actually spiritual blindness, or that apparent wickedness isn't actually enlightened service? The Forbidden Gospel forces us to confront the possibility that our most fundamental assumptions about good and evil might be completely inverted. The religious authorities who condemned Jesus might have been serving the false creator God who benefits from keeping humanity in spiritual darkness. The disciples who became the foundation of the Christian church might have been fundamentally mistaken about Jesus' identity and mission. The institutional religion that emerged from their teachings might actually be an obstacle to the spiritual liberation that Jesus came to facilitate. These are not comfortable thoughts for anyone raised within traditional Christian frameworks. They challenge not just specific doctrines or practices, but the entire foundation upon which institutional Christianity was built. This is why early church fathers like Irenaeus fought so desperately to suppress texts like the Gospel of Judas and brand them as dangerous heresies. But the Forbidden Gospel's challenge to Orthodox Christianity goes deeper than questions of religious authority or institutional legitimacy. It presents a fundamentally different understanding of what it means to be human and what constitutes authentic spiritual development. According to traditional Christian teaching, human beings are fallen creatures who need salvation through faith in Jesus Christ and participation in the sacraments administered by the Church. We're encouraged to accept our limitations, submit to religious authority, and trust that God's purposes will be fulfilled even when we can't understand them. The Gospel of Judas presents a radically different vision. Here, human beings are divine souls who have been trapped in material existence and deceived about their true nature. Salvation doesn't come through faith or institutional participation, but through the acquisition of secret knowledge that reveals the truth about our spiritual origins and destiny. We're not called to humble submission, but to spiritual rebellion against the forces that keep us imprisoned in ignorance. This Gnostic understanding of human nature and spiritual development has profound implications for how we approach questions of religious authority, moral guidance, and spiritual practice. If we are divine beings who have forgotten our true nature, then our primary spiritual task isn't to obey external authorities, but to awaken to our own inner divinity. If the material world is a prison designed to keep us in ignorance, then traditional religious practices that celebrate or sanctify earthly existence might actually be counterproductive to our spiritual development. The Gospel of Judas suggests that authentic spiritual development requires us to question everything we've been taught about reality, morality, and religious truth. It encourages a kind of spiritual skepticism that refuses to accept conventional wisdom simply because it's endorsed by established authorities. Instead, it calls us to seek direct personal experience of spiritual truth, even when that experience conflicts with official teachings or social expectations. This approach to spirituality is simultaneously liberating and terrifying. It offers the possibility of direct divine knowledge and personal spiritual transformation, but it also removes the comfort and security that come from having clear external guidance about right and wrong, truth and falsehood. It places enormous responsibility on individual seekers to develop their own capacity for spiritual discernment, while navigating a world filled with deceptive forces that benefit from keeping them confused and ignorant. The figure of Judas, as presented in this Forbidden Gospel, becomes a model for this kind of spiritually autonomous development. He doesn't rely on external authorities or conventional moral categories to guide his actions. Instead, he develops his own direct relationship with cosmic truth and acts according to his personal understanding of what serves the highest spiritual purposes, even when doing so violates every social and religious expectation. This portrayal of Judas as the spiritually autonomous disciple creates a profound challenge to any form of religious authority that claims exclusive access to divine truth. If authentic spiritual development requires personal awakening to cosmic reality, then no external institution or authority figure can do this work for us. At best, they can provide guidance and support. At worst, they can become obstacles that prevent us from discovering our own divine nature. The Gospel of Judas implies that the early Christian church fell into this latter category by establishing a hierarchy of bishops and priests who claimed apostolic authority, by creating standardized doctrines and practices that all believers were expected to accept, by condemning alternative perspectives as heresies that threatened salvation. The institutional church became another form of spiritual imprisonment rather than a pathway to liberation. This critique of institutional religion extends far beyond Christianity to encompass any religious or spiritual system that prioritizes external authority over personal spiritual development. The Forbidden Gospel suggests that authentic spirituality is inherently individualistic and revolutionary, requiring each seeker to question established authorities and develop their own direct relationship with divine reality. But this individualistic approach to spirituality also creates significant challenges and dangers. Without clear external guidance, how can spiritual seekers distinguish between authentic divine revelation and self-deceptive fantasy? How can they avoid the spiritual pride and isolation that can result from believing they possess special knowledge that others lack? How can they maintain connection with human community while pursuing a path that necessarily sets them apart from conventional religious and social expectations? The Gospel of Judas doesn't provide easy answers to these questions, but it does suggest that the risks of spiritual autonomy are preferable to the certain spiritual death that results from accepting false religious authority. According to this text, it's better to risk spiritual error while pursuing authentic truth than to accept comfortable lies that keep us trapped in ignorance. The Forbidden Gospel presents Judas as someone who successfully navigated these challenges, developing genuine spiritual understanding while maintaining his humanity and his love for others. His willingness to sacrifice his reputation and his place in history for the sake of cosmic truth demonstrates that authentic spiritual development doesn't require us to become cold or uncaring, but it may require us to transcend conventional moral categories in service of higher purposes. This understanding of spiritual development as potentially requiring us to act against conventional expectations has profound implications for how we evaluate moral and religious claims in our own time. The Gospel of Judas suggests that we should be deeply suspicious of any authority that demands unquestioning obedience or condemns alternative perspectives without engaging with their substantive content. It encourages us to develop our own capacity for spiritual discernment, while remaining open to the possibility that important truths might be found in unexpected places or preserved by marginalized communities. If Judas could be so completely misunderstood by conventional religious authorities, what other valuable perspectives might have been dismissed or suppressed by institutional prejudice? These questions become particularly relevant when we consider contemporary debates about religious authority, spiritual practice, and the relationship between individual conscience and institutional guidance. The Gospel of Judas provides a historical example of how alternative spiritual perspectives can be marginalized and eventually eliminated through institutional power rather than theological argument. The text also offers insights into the psychology of spiritual seeking and the challenges faced by individuals who feel called to pursue authentic truth rather than comfortable conformity. Judas becomes a symbol for anyone who has ever felt alienated from conventional religious community because of their spiritual insights or their unwillingness to accept official teachings without question. But perhaps most importantly, the Gospel of Judas forces us to confront the possibility that our most fundamental assumptions about good and evil, faithfulness and betrayal, truth and falsehood might be far more complex and paradoxical than we've been taught to believe. The story of Judas as the enlightened betrayer suggests that reality itself might be more mysterious and morally ambiguous than our conventional categories can capture. This recognition of moral and spiritual complexity doesn't necessarily lead to relativism or nihilism. Instead, it can inspire a more nuanced and sophisticated approach to spiritual and ethical questions, one that acknowledges the limitations of simple answers while maintaining commitment to the pursuit of authentic truth and genuine spiritual development. As we prepare to explore the final implications of this forbidden gospel, we must grapple with the possibility that the most important spiritual truths might sometimes be found in the most unexpected and unwelcome places. The Gospel of Judas challenges us to remain open to revolutionary possibilities while developing the discernment necessary to distinguish between authentic spiritual insight and dangerous deception. The story it tells about the ultimate betrayer, who was actually the ultimate hero, serves as a powerful reminder that spiritual truth is often paradoxical, that authentic spirituality may require us to transcend conventional moral categories, and that the courage to pursue truth wherever it leads might be the most important virtue we can develop in our spiritual journey. The forbidden nature of this gospel becomes even more apparent when we examine how it was literally buried and forgotten for nearly 17 centuries. This wasn't accidental preservation. This was deliberate erasure, a systematic campaign to ensure that certain ideas about the nature of divine truth would never see the light of day again. When Orthodox Christian leaders gained political power in the Roman Empire during the 4th century, they didn't just argue against alternative gospels like the Gospel of Judas. They actively sought to destroy every copy they could find. Libraries were raided, manuscripts were burned, and anyone caught possessing or copying these forbidden texts faced severe punishment. The survival of the Gospel of Judas represents nothing short of a miracle of preservation. Someone, at tremendous personal risk, carefully wrapped this dangerous document in leather, placed it in a limestone box, and buried it in the Egyptian desert. They knew they were preserving something that could cost them their life if discovered. Yet they understood that future generations might need access to these suppressed truths. Think about the courage required for such an act. These weren't just academic documents or historical curiosities. These were texts that challenged the fundamental power structures of their world. By preserving the Gospel of Judas, unknown guardians were maintaining an alternative vision of spiritual reality that directly threatened the authority of the emerging institutional church. The rediscovery of this forbidden gospel in our modern era creates an unprecedented opportunity to examine these suppressed perspectives with fresh eyes. We're no longer bound by the political and institutional pressures that shaped early Christian orthodoxy. We can approach these texts as historical documents that preserve authentic voices from the diverse Christian communities of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. What emerges from this examination is a picture of early Christianity, far more complex and intellectually sophisticated than most people realize. The communities that produced and preserved texts like the Gospel of Judas weren't primitive heretics or deluded cultists. They were thoughtful spiritual seekers grappling with profound questions about the nature of reality, the problem of evil, and the relationship between divine truth and human institutions. Their answers to these questions differed dramatically from those developed by Orthodox Christianity, but they weren't arrived at casually or carelessly. The Gospel of Judas represents centuries of theological reflection, mystical experience, and spiritual practice within communities that took these matters as seriously as any Orthodox theologians. Consider the intellectual courage required to develop and maintain the cosmological framework presented in this forbidden gospel. These communities were willing to question the most fundamental assumptions of their religious heritage. They refused to accept comfortable answers that failed to address the full complexity of human experience in a world filled with suffering and injustice. The Orthodox position maintained that God created the world and pronounced it good, that suffering entered through human disobedience, and that salvation comes through faith in Christ and participation in church sacraments. This framework provided clear moral guidelines and institutional authority, but it struggled to explain why an all-powerful, all-loving deity would permit such widespread suffering and evil. The Gnostic communities that preserved the Gospel of Judas developed a more complex but potentially more honest response to these troubling realities. They suggested that the world's suffering isn't a mystery requiring faith to accept, but evidence that the material realm was created by a deity who either doesn't understand or actively opposes genuine spiritual welfare. This explanation required them to reconceptualize the entire biblical narrative. The God of the Old Testament becomes not the ultimate divine reality, but a lesser spiritual being who has mistaken himself for the supreme deity. The creation story becomes not the account of a perfect beginning spoiled by human disobedience, but the description of a flawed copy of spiritual reality designed to imprison divine souls in ignorance. Jesus' mission in this framework isn't to establish a religion or found a church, but to share secret knowledge that can liberate awakened souls from their material prison. His death becomes not a sacrifice to appease divine justice, but a demonstration that divine spirits can escape the material realm and return to their true spiritual home. And Judas's role in this cosmic drama becomes not betrayal motivated by greed, but willing participation in a sacred mission that required someone to facilitate Jesus' arrest while understanding the true spiritual significance of these events. This reinterpretation of familiar stories wasn't undertaken lightly. It required these communities to distance themselves from mainstream Judaism and emerging Orthodox Christianity, accepting the social isolation and potential persecution that came with maintaining unpopular perspectives. Yet they persisted in developing and preserving these alternative interpretations, because they believed conventional religious answers were inadequate to address the full reality of human spiritual experience. They were willing to be branded as heretics and face potential martyrdom rather than accept teachings they considered spiritually shallow or intellectually dishonest. The Gospel of Judas preserves their most sophisticated theological reflection on questions that continue to challenge thoughtful believers today. How do we reconcile belief in a loving God with the reality of widespread suffering? How do we distinguish between authentic spiritual authority and institutional power? How do we pursue spiritual truth when doing so conflicts with social expectations and religious conventions? These aren't just ancient questions. They remain central challenges for anyone seeking authentic spiritual development in any era. The Forbidden Gospel's approach to these issues may not provide all the answers, but it demonstrates a level of intellectual honesty and spiritual courage that deserves serious consideration. The text's portrayal of Judas as the enlightened disciple serves as a powerful symbol for the kind of spiritual independence these communities valued. Judas doesn't rely on external religious authorities to determine right and wrong. He develops his own direct relationship with cosmic truth and acts according to his personal understanding of what serves the highest spiritual purposes. This spiritual autonomy comes with enormous risks. Without clear external guidance, seekers must develop their own capacity for discernment while navigating a world filled with deceptive forces that benefit from keeping people confused and ignorant. The possibility of self-deception, spiritual pride, and dangerous isolation are ever-present threats. But the Gospel of Judas suggests these risks are preferable to the certain spiritual death that results from accepting false religious authority. According to this perspective, it's better to risk error while pursuing authentic truth than to accept comfortable lies that keep us trapped in spiritual mediocrity. The Forbidden Gospel presents Judas as someone who successfully navigated these challenges. He maintained his humanity and his capacity for love while developing genuine spiritual understanding that enabled him to transcend conventional moral categories in service of cosmic truth. His willingness to sacrifice his reputation and his place in history demonstrates that authentic spiritual development doesn't require us to become callous or uncaring. Instead, it may require us to develop forms of love and loyalty that go beyond ordinary human understanding. The love Judas demonstrates for Jesus transcends personal affection or emotional attachment. It becomes a willingness to serve the highest spiritual purposes, even when doing so requires actions that will be completely misunderstood by everyone except the person being served. This understanding of transcendent love has profound implications for how we approach spiritual relationships and community. It suggests that authentic spiritual fellowship isn't based primarily on emotional compatibility or shared social backgrounds, but on mutual commitment to pursuing truth regardless of personal cost. The communities that preserved the Gospel of Judas embodied this kind of transcendent spiritual fellowship. They maintained their alternative perspectives despite facing persecution from both Jewish and Christian authorities. They preserved dangerous texts at enormous personal risk. They developed sophisticated theological frameworks that addressed questions Orthodox authorities preferred to ignore. Their example demonstrates that authentic spiritual community can exist even when it operates outside or against established religious institutions. Indeed, the Forbidden Gospel suggests that the most important spiritual insights might be preserved precisely by communities that are willing to challenge conventional religious wisdom. This has significant implications for contemporary spiritual seekers who feel alienated from traditional religious institutions. The Gospel of Judas provides historical precedent for the idea that authentic spirituality might sometimes require us to distance ourselves from established religious authorities in order to pursue truth more directly. But it also demonstrates the importance of finding community with others who share this commitment to authentic spiritual development. The preservation of the Gospel of Judas wasn't accomplished by isolated individuals, but by communities of seekers who supported each other in maintaining unpopular perspectives and dangerous practices. These communities developed their own forms of spiritual authority based on direct experience of divine truth rather than institutional position or apostolic succession. They validated teachings not by their conformity to official doctrine, but by their capacity to facilitate genuine spiritual transformation in those who received them. The Gospel of Judas reflects this approach to spiritual authority. Its claims about Judas aren't based on historical evidence in the conventional sense, but on mystical revelations received by community members who claim direct access to cosmic truth. These revelations were accepted not because they came from officially recognized authorities, but because they provided insights that helped explain aspects of spiritual reality that conventional teachings left unexplored. This approach to religious truth creates both opportunities and dangers. On one hand, it opens the possibility for genuine spiritual innovation and the discovery of insights that institutional authorities might overlook or suppress. On the other hand, it removes the safeguards that institutional oversight provides against self-deception and dangerous delusion. The Gospel of Judas demonstrates both the potential benefits and risks of this approach. Its reinterpretation of the Judas story provides profound insights into questions of spiritual authority, moral complexity, and the relationship between conventional wisdom and authentic truth. But it also reflects cosmological speculations that seem to have little grounding in historical reality or empirical observation. Contemporary readers must therefore approach this forbidden gospel with both openness and discernment. We can appreciate its insights into spiritual and psychological dynamics while maintaining appropriate skepticism about its historical and cosmological claims. We can learn from its challenge to conventional religious authority without accepting its alternative authority claims uncritically. Perhaps the most valuable contribution of the Gospel of Judas lies not in its specific teachings about cosmology or salvation, but in its demonstration that spiritual truth is often more complex and paradoxical than conventional religious categories suggest. The text forces us to confront the possibility that our most fundamental assumptions about good and evil, faithfulness and betrayal, truth and falsehood, might need serious reconsideration. This recognition of moral and spiritual complexity doesn't necessarily lead to relativism or the conclusion that all perspectives are equally valid. Instead, it can inspire a more nuanced approach to spiritual and ethical questions that acknowledges the limitations of simple answers while maintaining commitment to the pursuit of authentic truth. The Forbidden Gospel's portrayal of Judas as both betrayer and hero serves as a powerful reminder that reality itself might be more morally ambiguous than our conventional categories can capture. This doesn't mean abandoning the attempt to distinguish between right and wrong, but it does suggest that these distinctions might be more difficult and contextual than we often assume. In our contemporary context, where traditional religious authorities face unprecedented challenges to their credibility and relevance, the Gospel of Judas provides valuable perspectives on the relationship between institutional power and authentic spirituality. It reminds us that important spiritual insights have often been preserved by marginalized communities rather than established authorities. The text also offers encouragement to spiritual seekers who feel called to pursue authentic truth even when doing so conflicts with conventional religious expectations. The figure of Judas becomes a symbol for anyone who has ever experienced the isolation that can come from questioning popular beliefs or challenging established authorities. But perhaps most importantly, the Gospel of Judas challenges us to remain open to the possibility that spiritual truth might sometimes be found in the most unexpected places. If the ultimate betrayer could actually be the ultimate hero, then we must be prepared to reconsider our judgments about spiritual authenticity wherever we encounter them. This openness to unexpected truth doesn't require us to abandon critical thinking or accept every alternative claim without evaluation. Instead, it calls us to develop the kind of spiritual discernment that can distinguish between authentic insight and dangerous deception, while remaining humble about the limitations of our current understanding. The communities that preserved the Gospel of Judas demonstrated this kind of spiritual discernment. They were willing to challenge conventional wisdom when they found it inadequate, but they also developed sophisticated criteria for evaluating spiritual claims based on their capacity to facilitate genuine transformation and liberation. Their example suggests that authentic spiritual development requires both the courage to question established authorities and the wisdom to recognize genuine spiritual insight when we encounter it. The forbidden gospel they preserved continues to offer both challenges and insights to contemporary seekers willing to engage seriously with its provocative vision of spiritual reality. As we approach the conclusion of our exploration into this forbidden text, we must grapple with the ultimate question it poses. What does it mean to live authentically in a world where the most important truths might be found in the most unexpected places, preserved by the most unlikely guardians, and embodied by the most misunderstood figures in human history? The Gospel of Judas doesn't provide easy answers to this question, but it offers a compelling example of communities that took this challenge seriously enough to risk everything in order to preserve alternative perspectives for future generations. Their courage in maintaining dangerous truths continues to inspire and challenge us today, reminding us that the pursuit of authentic spirituality has never been safe or comfortable, but it has always been worth the risks involved. The weight of these revelations becomes even more staggering when we consider what they mean for our understanding of divine justice itself. According to the Forbidden Gospel, the very concept of justice as understood by traditional Christianity might be fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Think about this carefully. If the God worshipped by billions of believers throughout history isn't the true divine source, then every prayer for justice, every plea for divine intervention, every act of faith performed in the name of righteousness has been misdirected toward a deity who either cannot or will not provide genuine spiritual liberation. The Gospel of Judas presents a universe where apparent injustice isn't a mystery requiring faith to understand, but the natural result of a cosmic system designed to prevent human souls from discovering their true divine nature. The suffering of the innocent, the prosperity of the wicked, the apparent silence of heaven in the face of earthly tragedy. All of these troubling realities become evidence not of divine mystery, but of spiritual imprisonment. This understanding transforms every aspect of how we might approach questions of meaning and purpose in human existence. The traditional Christian narrative offers hope through suffering, promising that earthly trials serve divine purposes we cannot comprehend. But the Forbidden Gospel suggests something far more radical: that suffering itself is evidence we're trapped in a realm created by forces opposed to our genuine spiritual welfare. Consider what this means for how we evaluate religious experience itself. Every moment of transcendence felt during traditional worship, every sense of divine presence experienced through conventional prayer, every feeling of spiritual connection achieved through orthodox religious practice. The Gospel of Judas implies these experiences might actually be forms of spiritual deception, keeping souls satisfied with limited spiritual experiences rather than seeking the complete liberation that true divine knowledge provides. The text suggests that the false creator God benefits from maintaining just enough authentic spiritual experience to keep people believing they're on the right path, while preventing them from discovering the deeper truths that would enable complete escape from material imprisonment. Traditional religious ecstasy becomes a kind of spiritual narcotic, providing temporary relief from existential suffering while ensuring continued bondage to the very system that creates that suffering. This creates a profound challenge for anyone seeking authentic spiritual development. How can we distinguish between genuine divine experience and sophisticated spiritual deception? How can we know whether our most cherished religious insights are authentic revelations or elaborate illusions designed to maintain our imprisonment? The Gospel of Judas offers one disturbing criterion: authentic spiritual knowledge will necessarily bring us into conflict with established religious authorities and conventional moral expectations. The closer we come to genuine truth, the more we'll be condemned by the very institutions and communities that claim to represent divine will. This principle explains why Judas, according to the Forbidden Gospel, was destined to become history's most hated figure. His willingness to act according to cosmic truth rather than conventional religious expectations automatically placed him in opposition to every form of spiritual authority that derived its power from maintaining comfortable illusions about the nature of reality. The text implies that this pattern continues throughout history. Those who achieve authentic spiritual insight will find themselves increasingly alienated from religious communities that mistake partial truths for complete revelation. The more profound their understanding becomes, the more they'll be branded as dangerous heretics by authorities who cannot comprehend the cosmic significance of what they've discovered. But the Gospel of Judas also suggests that this persecution serves a divine purpose. By forcing authentic spiritual seekers to rely on direct divine revelation rather than institutional guidance, the opposition they face actually accelerates their spiritual development. They're compelled to develop personal relationships with cosmic truth that transcend any form of external religious authority. Judas becomes the perfect embodiment of this principle. By accepting the role that would make him universally despised, he demonstrated complete liberation from concern about human approval or social acceptance. His actions were guided purely by cosmic truth, as revealed through his direct relationship with Jesus, without any regard for how those actions would be interpreted by religious authorities or future generations. This understanding of spiritual development as necessarily involving separation from conventional religious community creates profound psychological challenges for seekers attracted to the Forbidden Gospel's vision. Human beings are social creatures who naturally seek belonging and approval from their communities. The prospect of spiritual development that requires accepting permanent exile from normal religious fellowship represents a kind of martyrdom that might be even more difficult than physical death. Yet the text suggests this sacrifice is essential for anyone who truly wants to serve the highest spiritual purposes. Complete spiritual liberation requires transcending not just material attachments, but social and religious attachments as well. The seeker must be willing to stand alone with cosmic truth, even when that means being condemned by everyone they once considered spiritual authorities or community members. The Gospel of Judas presents this isolation not as a tragic consequence of spiritual seeking, but as a necessary stage in authentic spiritual development. Those who achieve genuine cosmic understanding must be prepared to live as strangers in a world that operates according to principles they know to be false. They become bridges between the divine realm and the material world, but bridges that are often rejected by both sides. This liminal existence requires extraordinary spiritual strength and clarity. The enlightened seeker must maintain connection to cosmic truth while navigating a world filled with people who are completely unaware of their spiritual imprisonment. They must act with love and compassion toward those who condemn them, understanding that this condemnation arises from ignorance rather than malice. The Forbidden Gospel suggests that Jesus demonstrated this kind of transcendent love throughout his ministry. Even while revealing to Judas the true nature of the other disciples' spiritual limitations, he continued to work with them and care for them. He understood that their inability to comprehend cosmic truth didn't make them enemies, but simply placed them at different stages of spiritual development. Similarly, Judas's willingness to accept eternal condemnation for the sake of Jesus' liberation represents love that transcends ordinary human categories. This wasn't emotional attachment or personal affection, but pure spiritual service that considers cosmic purposes more important than individual reputation or comfort. The text implies that this kind of transcendent love is the ultimate goal of authentic spiritual development. As seekers progress toward genuine cosmic understanding, they develop the capacity to serve the highest spiritual purposes, regardless of personal cost. They become willing to sacrifice not just their lives, but their place in human memory, if doing so advances the cause of spiritual liberation for others. But the Gospel of Judas also reveals the terrible loneliness that accompanies this level of spiritual development. Judas couldn't share his true mission with the other disciples because they lacked the spiritual sophistication to understand it. He couldn't explain his actions to the religious authorities who condemned Jesus because they were serving the very spiritual forces that his mission was designed to overcome. Even after Jesus' death and resurrection, Judas remained isolated with knowledge that no one else could comprehend or appreciate. He had to live with the understanding that his greatest act of spiritual service would be remembered as history's ultimate betrayal, that his deepest expression of love would be interpreted as the most devastating faithlessness. This aspect of the Forbidden Gospel speaks powerfully to contemporary spiritual seekers who feel alienated from traditional religious communities because of insights that others cannot share or understand. The figure of Judas becomes a symbol for anyone who has experienced the isolation that can result from questioning popular religious beliefs or challenging established spiritual authorities. The text suggests that this isolation, while painful, is also a sign of authentic spiritual progress. Those who remain completely comfortable within conventional religious frameworks may be missing the deeper truths that require leaving familiar spiritual territory to discover. The discomfort of spiritual seeking might actually indicate that genuine development is occurring. But the Gospel of Judas also warns against the spiritual pride that can result from believing oneself to possess special knowledge that others lack. Judas's greatness, according to the text, didn't lie in his superior understanding alone, but in his willingness to use that understanding in service of purposes greater than his own spiritual advancement. The Forbidden Gospel presents authentic spiritual development, not as an achievement that elevates the seeker above others, but as a calling that makes the seeker more available to serve cosmic purposes that benefit all spiritual beings. Knowledge becomes dangerous when it's pursued for its own sake rather than as a means of serving the divine plan for universal liberation. This understanding of spiritual knowledge as inherently involving service creates important safeguards against the elitism and spiritual arrogance that can afflict alternative religious communities. The Gospel of Judas suggests that genuine cosmic understanding necessarily produces humility rather than pride, service rather than domination, sacrifice rather than self-aggrandizement. Those who truly comprehend the nature of spiritual reality understand that their knowledge isn't a personal possession but a divine gift that carries enormous responsibility. They recognize that they've been entrusted with cosmic secrets, not because they're superior to others, but because they're willing to use those secrets in service of purposes that transcend personal interest. The text implies that this willingness to serve transcendent purposes is what distinguishes authentic spiritual insight from self-deceptive fantasy. Genuine revelations produce greater capacity for love and sacrifice, while false revelations typically result in increased selfishness and spiritual pride. Judas, according to the Forbidden Gospel, demonstrated the authenticity of his spiritual understanding through his willingness to sacrifice everything: his reputation, his relationships, his place in history, in service of Jesus' cosmic mission. His apparent betrayal became the ultimate proof of his genuine enlightenment. This criterion for evaluating spiritual authenticity has profound implications for how we might assess contemporary religious movements and spiritual teachers. The Gospel of Judas suggests that we should be suspicious of any spiritual authority that seeks personal benefit, social status, or institutional power through their religious position. Instead, we should look for evidence of genuine sacrifice in service of transcendent purposes. Authentic spiritual teachers, like Judas in the Forbidden Gospel, might be willing to accept misunderstanding, persecution, or social rejection if doing so serves the cause of spiritual liberation for others. But the text also warns us that authentic spiritual service might sometimes appear to violate conventional moral expectations. Just as Judas's greatest act of love appeared to be ultimate betrayal, contemporary spiritual servants might need to act in ways that challenge popular religious assumptions or social conventions. This creates complex challenges for spiritual seekers trying to distinguish between authentic spiritual rebellion and dangerous antinomianism. How can we tell the difference between genuinely transcendent spiritual service and self-serving rejection of moral restraint? How can we recognize when apparent spiritual transgression actually serves higher purposes? The Gospel of Judas doesn't provide simple answers to these questions, but it does suggest that authentic spiritual transgression is always motivated by love rather than self-interest, always serves purposes greater than personal satisfaction, and always accepts the full consequences of acting against conventional expectations. Judas, according to the Forbidden Gospel, wasn't motivated by personal gain or emotional satisfaction when he agreed to facilitate Jesus' arrest. He was serving cosmic purposes that he understood would result in his own eternal condemnation. His transgression against conventional loyalty was actually the ultimate expression of transcendent faithfulness. This understanding of spiritual transgression as potentially serving higher purposes creates both opportunities and dangers for contemporary seekers. On one hand, it opens the possibility that some forms of spiritual rebellion against established authorities might actually represent authentic divine calling. On the other hand, it can be used to justify genuinely destructive behavior that serves selfish rather than transcendent purposes. The Forbidden Gospel implies that the difference lies in the ultimate direction of the action. Does it serve the liberation of spiritual beings from ignorance and suffering, or does it increase bondage and confusion? Does it demonstrate transcendent love that considers cosmic purposes more important than personal comfort? Or does it reflect ordinary selfishness disguised as spiritual insight? These questions become particularly relevant when we consider how the Gospel of Judas itself functions as a spiritual text. Its challenge to conventional Christian authority could serve the authentic purpose of liberating seekers from spiritual limitations imposed by institutional religion. But it could also simply replace one form of religious authority with another, creating new forms of spiritual elitism and sectarian division. The text's own criteria suggest that its value lies not in whether it provides comfortable answers or supports our preferred religious positions, but in whether it facilitates genuine spiritual development and increased capacity for transcendent service. If engaging with the Forbidden Gospel makes us more humble, more loving, and more willing to sacrifice for cosmic purposes, then it might be serving authentic spiritual functions, regardless of its historical accuracy. If, however, it simply reinforces our existing prejudices against religious authority or provides ammunition for spiritual arrogance, then it might be functioning as another form of spiritual deception rather than genuine liberation. The Gospel of Judas forces us to apply this same critical evaluation to all religious texts, teachings, and authorities, rather than accepting or rejecting spiritual claims based on their compatibility with our existing beliefs. or their endorsement by established authorities. We're called to evaluate them based on their capacity to facilitate authentic spiritual development and transcendent service. This approach to spiritual discernment requires enormous personal responsibility and spiritual maturity. We can't rely on external authorities to determine truth for us, but we also can't simply accept whatever appeals to our personal preferences or confirms our existing assumptions. Instead, we must develop our own capacity to recognize authentic spiritual insight, while remaining humble about the limitations of our current understanding. We must be willing to be wrong about important things, while maintaining commitment to the pursuit of authentic truth wherever it might lead. The communities that preserved the Gospel of Judas demonstrated this kind of spiritual courage and intellectual honesty. They maintained alternative perspectives despite facing persecution from established authorities. They preserved dangerous knowledge at enormous personal cost. They refused to accept comfortable answers that failed to address the full complexity of spiritual reality. Their example continues to challenge contemporary seekers to maintain similar courage and honesty in our own spiritual development. Whether or not we accept their specific answers to cosmic questions, we can learn from their commitment to pursuing authentic truth regardless of social or institutional pressure. The forbidden gospel they preserved reminds us that the most important spiritual insights might sometimes be found in the most unexpected places, preserved by the most unlikely guardians, and embodied by the most misunderstood figures in human history. If Judas Iscariot could be transformed from history's ultimate villain into its most enlightened hero, then perhaps our other fundamental assumptions about spiritual reality deserve similar reconsideration. This possibility both terrifies and liberates us. It suggests that much of what we've been taught about good and evil, truth and falsehood, faithfulness and betrayal, might need profound revision. But it also opens unlimited possibilities for spiritual discovery and development that transcend the boundaries imposed by conventional religious categories. The Gospel of Judas stands as a testament to the courage required for this kind of spiritual adventure. Whether we follow its specific path or not, it challenges us to maintain openness to revolutionary possibilities while developing the discernment necessary to distinguish between authentic spiritual insight and dangerous self-deception. The forbidden gospel's greatest gift might not be its answers, but its questions. By forcing us to reconsider our most basic assumptions about spiritual reality, it creates space for genuine spiritual development that might otherwise be impossible within the confines of conventional religious thinking. As we prepare to conclude our exploration of this dangerous text, we must wrestle with its ultimate challenge. Are we willing to pursue authentic spiritual truth, even when it conflicts with everything we've been taught to believe? Are we prepared to follow the example of those who preserved this forbidden gospel, accepting the risks that come with maintaining unpopular perspectives in service of cosmic truth? The answer to these questions will determine not just how we understand the historical figure of Judas Iscariot, but how we approach the fundamental challenges of spiritual development in our own lives and communities. The truth we've uncovered tonight forces us to confront the most unsettling possibility of all, that everything we think we know about the greatest story ever told has been carefully constructed to hide an even greater truth. That the figure we've been taught to despise as history's ultimate villain might actually be its most profound hero. That the kiss in Gethsemane wasn't the mark of betrayal, but the seal of perfect love. The Gospel of Judas doesn't just challenge our understanding of one biblical character. It shatters the entire foundation upon which 2,000 years of Christian civilization has been built. It forces us to ask whether the institutions we've trusted, the authorities we've revered, and the truths we've accepted without question might themselves be the greatest deceptions ever perpetrated upon human consciousness. Consider what this means for every prayer ever offered, every sermon ever preached, every life ever dedicated to following the teachings that emerged from those 11 remaining disciples. If they fundamentally misunderstood the very nature of Jesus' mission, if they built their authority on foundations of ignorance rather than enlightenment, then what does that say about the spiritual edifice they constructed? The forbidden gospel suggests that authentic spiritual truth has always existed parallel to official religious teaching. preserved by communities willing to risk everything to maintain dangerous knowledge. These guardians understood that the most important revelations would necessarily be rejected by established authorities, that genuine spiritual insight would always appear as heresy to those invested in maintaining comfortable illusions. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of this entire revelation is what it tells us about the nature of spiritual courage itself. The Gospel of Judas presents us with a hero who was willing to sacrifice not just his life, but his eternal reputation, his place in human memory, his very identity as a good person, all in service of cosmic truth that only he and Jesus could fully comprehend. This represents a form of spiritual martyrdom that transcends anything we find in traditional Christian teaching. While conventional martyrs die for their faith and are remembered as saints, Judas lived forever as a villain in order to serve the highest spiritual purposes. His sacrifice was complete, total, and eternal, in ways that ordinary martyrdom could never match. The implications of this understanding extend far beyond ancient history, into the very heart of how we navigate spiritual truth in our own time. The Gospel of Judas challenges us to develop the kind of spiritual discernment that can recognize authentic divine service, even when it appears to violate every moral expectation we've been taught to honor. It forces us to confront the possibility that the most important spiritual work might sometimes require us to act against conventional religious wisdom, to challenge established authorities, and to accept misunderstanding from those we're actually trying to serve. The path of authentic spiritual development might lead not toward social acceptance and religious respectability, but toward the kind of radical independence that makes us strangers in every conventional spiritual community. This forbidden gospel serves as both warning and invitation. A warning that the pursuit of authentic spiritual truth will cost us everything we thought we knew about good and evil, right and wrong, faithfulness and betrayal. An invitation to join the ranks of those throughout history who have been willing to preserve dangerous truths despite the personal cost, who have chosen cosmic reality over comfortable illusion, who have followed the example of the most misunderstood hero in human history. The choice before us is the same one that confronted every reader of this forbidden text throughout the centuries when it lay hidden in the Egyptian desert. Will we dismiss these revelations as ancient heresies that threaten the stability of beliefs we're comfortable maintaining? Or will we allow them to transform our understanding of what it means to pursue authentic spiritual truth in a world where the most important revelations might be found in the most unexpected places? The Gospel of Judas doesn't provide easy answers to the questions that haunt every human heart. Instead, it offers something far more valuable and far more dangerous. It offers the possibility that reality itself might be more mysterious, more complex, and more revolutionary than any of us have dared to imagine. That the greatest truths might be preserved by the most unlikely guardians, embodied by the most condemned figures, and revealed through the most forbidden texts. Whether we accept its specific claims or not, this dangerous gospel reminds us that the pursuit of authentic spiritual truth has never been safe, comfortable, or socially acceptable. It has always required the kind of courage demonstrated by those who preserved this text through centuries of persecution, and ultimately by the figure at its center, the disciple whose apparent betrayal might actually represent the most perfect expression of love the world has ever known. The Forbidden Gospel of Judas stands as eternal testimony to the possibility that our deepest assumptions about spiritual reality might need complete revision, that our most trusted authorities might be preserving comfortable lies rather than dangerous truths, and that the path to authentic spiritual liberation might require us to follow the example of history's most misunderstood hero. The question that remains is not whether we can prove these claims to be historically accurate, but whether we possess the spiritual courage to remain open to revolutionary possibilities that could transform not just our understanding of ancient events, but our approach to the eternal questions that continue to shape human destiny. The forbidden story has been revealed. The hidden truth has been uncovered. Now the choice is ours.